Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and welcome to episode 34 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast with me, Rory Lees-Oakes, and with me is my good friend and fellow traveller on the information superhighway, Mr. Ken Kelly. How are you doing, Ken?
I am exceptionally well today, Rory. It's a bit of a sunny day, midwinter in the UK at the moment, at the time we're making this, but it's a bit of a sunny day, and it's kind of the sun coming through what has been grey up until now kind of makes everything feel a little lighter.
It does, Ken, and I'm reminded, at least here in the UK, that every day now is getting lighter, and that always cheers me up. It's a couple of seconds goes on every day. We have a little bit more light every day, and it certainly enhances my mental well-being. I like seeing the sun and how it kind of glistens in the trees. So, yeah, heading towards Easter in the UK, the gateway to summer, Ken.
Love it.
Which is warm rain in the UK nowadays.
And I guess if you're listening to this in the southern hemisphere, you'll be heading towards winter. And I wonder how that changes. And it's interesting. It's all about frame of reference, isn't it? And the other day, I'm on a course at the moment, a CPD course for my practice related to counselling. And I was speaking about frame of reference to a colleague on the course, and we were talking about a sandwich, Rory, and how you go in and you look at the sandwiches because it's lunchtime and you're really hungry, the tummy is rumbling, and when you need to choose which size of sandwich you want to have, the larger one from your frame of reference for this hunger within looks like the best choice. And as you get near the end of this big sandwich and you're throwing a bit away, you look with a different frame of reference, which is, I actually could have gone for the smaller one and I would have been okay. Okay.
Well, that's the difference between your frame of reference and mine. That never happens in my frame of reference. A couple of sandwiches eaten.
We've got a great episode for you today. We're going to be speaking, first off, about something that you may find useful. It's maybe something that will be out of your frame of reference, out of your thought, out of your awareness, but really important if it ever comes in, and that is the loss of data. So you're busy studying, you have all of your notes all neatly stored on your computer, and your computer crashes. What do you do? Because that's an absolute nightmare. We're going to be looking at that together. And then Theory with Rory today. Really interesting. Bringing the theory of Margaret Warner, speaking about fragile process, Rory.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. And we're going to be talking about person-centered therapy and working with people with active psychosis. And we're going to be talking about the work of this pioneering therapist who's really pushed the envelope of person-centered therapy along the road. And she's called Margaret Warner. She's Dr. Margaret Warner, and she is based at the Chicago Counselling Center and in the Illinois School of Psychology, which is not far down the road from the West Park man, Mr. Rogers. So it's amazing, isn't it, how ideas flourish in the places that they start. A bit like seeds, really, landing a little bit away from trees and growing in the same area. So we're going to look at fragile process, Margaret Warner, and a new development in person-centered therapy. So if you're doing an assignment on the newer developments in person-centered therapy, this really isn't one to miss. And I've got a handout, Ken, for this. So if you go to episode 34 at www.counsellingtutor.com, there's two L's in counselling. We spell it the British way or the UK way. You go to episode 34, and in the show notes, there's a handout which gives you an overview of fragile process that you'll be able to use for your notes when you're doing your developments in person-centered therapy. All good stuff, Ken.
Looking forward to that one. And then we're going to end off speaking about, I guess, what we consider to be the cornerstone of a therapeutic relationship, and that is confidentiality. And as counsellors, as psychotherapists, we train, we learn about confidentiality, we learn where we have to break confidentiality, when we are mandated to by our ethical framework, by the law. However, there are times when we can inadvertently break confidentiality, where it kind of slips out when we're not maybe thinking that we're leaking somebody else's information. We're going to be speaking about that and how easy that can happen and how we can guard ourselves within our practice. But starting off with the nightmare topic, really, you started by saying that introducing me as your colleague on the superhighway of information. And these days, we tend to store our information electronically. We might keep our notes from class on our from our studies on a laptop, on a tablet, electronically. And what happens if the file gets corrupt? What happens if you lose a hard drive? And it does happen. It has happened. What's your thoughts around that, Rory?
Well, what the audience don't know is before we recorded this podcast, Ken went into the folder of the last podcast to discover that he thought that he hadn't placed the audio file in it. And because of what we do and because, of the checks and balances we have to do, Ken makes numerous backups and it was recovered and all was good in the world. But not every person has the amount of equipment and the technology that we have. So through the years, I've had students who've been in tears. They've saved a file and their computer's crashed. Or they've saved a file and when they print it out, it's in hieroglyphics because it's a different file format. Or that it's just got lost, it's got corrupted. And, this topic's driven by someone who's put a picture in our Facebook feed. So if you search Facebook and Counselling Tutor, we have a little community of people. Well, it's not little, it's 4,500 people now. Pop in there. And you can join like-minded people. But in there is a picture of a computer screen with Microsoft Word on it with file not found. Underneath is a story of someone saying, I've 2,800 words gone. And it's really interesting because when I was a lecturer in counselling, I was invited by Google to visit one of their educational centres, which was a pop-up tent in a sports pavilion in Wigan. So I lived the high life. They didn't invite me to California, Ken, sadly. But when I went, one of the things they were promoting was Google Docs, and it's free. Yeah. It's free. And the wonderful thing about it is you make your assignment and you close your browser down and the thing saves it as long as you've got an internet connection. And it's the way forward. I know a lot of schools now are using Google Classroom for that reason, so information can't get lost. And I'd recommend you have a look at it. It's slightly different to Microsoft Word, but it's absolutely free, absolutely free. And if you're a student and, it's not cheap doing counselling courses. If you're thinking I've got to spend £100 buying a word processing document or $100 now that the pound has got equal parity with it.
Tell me about it.
Or 10,000 euros or whatever. It is well worth looking at Google Docs, and I know a lot of tutors are using Google Docs. And the only thing is, it's a bit of a leap of faith. You write your assignment, and then you shut the browser down like you would if you were on the internet, and you don't press the save button. It just saves automatically for you, but it is fantastic. And here's the thing, Ken. This is what I like about it. If you've got yourself a Gmail account, you can automatically email your document to anybody else or share it or collaborate with it. In fact, we use it in the CSR, our online library, for books. So there's a document in the library and all I do is externally of the library just add reading books in, and it updates the document. So Google Documents, have a look at it. If you're using Google Chrome, which is a browser, if you go into the little dots on the right-hand side on the top, there's like little dots. You open it up and it's got the equivalent of PowerPoint, Word, Excel, loads of stuff for free. And, as long as you've got an internet connection, you're never going to lose your documents. Fantastic.
So that what you've spoke about there, Rory, is what's called cloud-based servers, where your documents are not stored on your computer or your hard drive. They are remotely stored. And it's really handy. And there is an alternative to Google Docs, and it's called Dropbox. And Dropbox is also free for a limited amount of space, more than enough space to store notes and study documents on, certainly. And if you need more space than that, then you can buy their premium upgrade. So it's kind of, they'll say, oh, need more space? Click here to buy more space. But that is also a cloud-based server. So your documents, as you work on them, are in real time, are updated onto a cloud server. So that is to do with your studies. Oh, and then, of course, there are also little software programs and backups programs that you can buy that run on your computer itself. So one that I can highly recommend is called CrashPlan. So it's crash, which is not a happy word, but I guess losing your data is not a happy plan. Really inexpensive. I use it, and what CrashPlan does is, for a very small monthly fee, in fact, I think they may even have a free version of that as well, worth going and having a look at for a very, very small monthly fee. It backs up the whole of your computer and stores it remotely. So any file that you inadvertently delete, because that's another way to lose it, you misname a file, delete it, and then it's gone and you can't find it. You can restore anything. So if your computer crashes or you inadvertently delete something. So that is one consideration. And I guess it goes further in thinking about what about when you are in practice? What about when you are in placement and you are dealing with client notes? How are you storing those and how are you protecting those notes? Because we're called by the BACP ethical framework to hold notes for at least 5 years. So if something was to happen, and those notes were called for by a court order, and you had a crash within that time on your computer, how might that look? So it is a consideration, isn't it, to how we back up our documents. And I certainly have, looking in front of me now, 4 external hard drives, Rory, all password protected, for various different jobs that they do. And I make sure that I keep a backup of absolutely everything. And I have CrashPlan running, and I use Mac, which runs something called Time Machine. So even my backups have got backups. But it's definitely worth considering.
It is. And the other thing is you can use an old Cold War trick that spies used to use in the Cold War. And that is to mail out your assignment to yourself. Spies during the Cold War, when Russia and the rest of the world were kind of at odds with each other, would post documents in the postal system, so they didn't carry them on them, and then they would go and pick them up at the post office, so that the postal system actually had them. And one of the really easy ways of protecting your documents is when you save it. If you've got the saved document, just email it to yourself. Because if you've got an email like Hotmail or Google Mail or Yahoo or all those kind of things, they store them on the cloud. Really simple. Just email it to yourself. And even if you don't, and even if, here's the thing, Ken, even if you don't send it, you save it as a draft, you're still saving it externally.
I like it. I really do. And one thing I just wanted to end on in this, because I spoke about all my multiple external hard drives, and I get it that when generally, I don't know if I can speak generally, many people, let me rather say, are not tech orientated and computer orientated that maybe study counselling and psychotherapy. I'm sure many are. But when I'm speaking about external hard drive, all I'm speaking about is some way of backing up your data that is not based on your computer. So if your computer is lost or stolen or broken or bursts into flames or gets a virus, that the information is safely stored externally. And it's so cheap today. I went into a store over Christmas because I was buying a gift for my daughter, and she got a new phone, and I bought 128 gigabytes, which is more space than you will need for 10 years of study if you're just saving documents, for around £30. And Rory, it was smaller than the size of a postage stamp.
Oh, I know, Ken. The technology's moved on. But one further thing, when technology fails, the pen drive gives up or the hard drive gives up, don't throw them away. One of the things is that the data, even if it's corrupt, the data is still there, and smart tech folks can get in there, use programs. I have them myself, not that I'm a smart tech folk, but it is a recovery program like Ken uses, and you can recover the data. And a few years ago, a national newspaper went down the local tip. This really is dredging the bottom of the barrel, Ken. I mean, a reporter running around in a skip. And they salvaged about 10 old computers, and they removed the hard drives that people had left in. And guess what? They could access all the data. So if I ever get rid of a computer, I take out the hard drive and I store it in my loft. And if my pen drive gives up the ghost, it goes in a little bag which gets stored in the loft. If it's got any confidential information on.
Hold that thought, because I tell you why. We're going to be talking about confidentiality after we visit theory with Rory, and that just ties in so well. Because if your notes were in that tip and they were accessible, wow. So I'm just going back to when I studied counselling. I remember I was on a person-centred course, and I remember realising that there were certain groups that were not ideal fit for person-centered counselling, and that would be somebody that maybe had psychological issues. So that and it was not an ideal fit, and that is how it was. But there has been future developments in person-centered counselling, and that's what you're going to be talking about today. You're going to be speaking about the work of Dr. Margaret Warner and fragile process.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. When we talk about mental health problems, I mean, I guess that anybody who presents to a counsellor in the general sphere of things has a mental health issue. It's about the health of our mental well-being. But what we're talking about is presentations that would typically be dealt with by medication, maybe a doctor, medical model presentations. And I'm loath to say that, to be honest with you, because I think suffering, it shouldn't really be categorised. But things like psychosis, where people are disassociated, their reality is completely different for a short time or a period of time from others, and we're talking about schizophrenia, psychosis, which is on the same scale, bipolar disorders, which again is on the same scale, and people with multiple personality disorders, where they exist in two different places in terms of who they are. And traditionally, that was a medical model. It was worked with in medication and certain forms of therapy. And indeed, Rogers himself did some work at Wisconsin with what he called a psych project, which was short for psychosis. It wasn't that successful from what I've read, but Margaret Warner has developed this idea, and it's called fragile process. And I'm going to be talking about this idea in person-centered therapy. It's not one, I have to be really clear here, it's not one you could practice without a lot of training. So you couldn't be a person-centered therapist, hear my broadcast and go, oh, I think I'll try that. I think it needs a lot of training and a lot of thought. But it certainly is a new development in person-centered therapy. And also it decategorises and pathologizes some mental health issues. It sees people as human. And when I worked in mental health as a support worker, the psychiatrist would sometimes say, what's wrong with you? Not how did this happen? And I think that is a big difference between medical model and the therapy model. We work with the process of where people have got to.
You've certainly piqued my interest. Without any further ado, It is Theory with Rory.
Counselling Theory with Rory Lees Oakes.
Before I start this Theory with Rory section, please be aware that some of the broadcast contains narratives regarding the impact of sexual abuse on children. To understand the term fragile process, we need to explore the causes of it. Dr. Margaret Warner, a Chicago-based psychotherapist, proposes that children who are abused in the first 7 years of life may disassociate the experience as a coping mechanism. In other words, unable to physically escape the abuser, children develop a hiding place in their mind which they can escape to. She cites one client who found that staring at the dots on the wallpaper helped her separate herself from the terror and anguish of being abused by her father. Some clients describe out-of-body experiences, such as watching events from the ceiling. Warner believes the reason for this is that children are highly susceptible to hypnosis, and during stressful or terrifying events and lacking more complex ways of coping, they sometimes find disassociation as a solution. In cases like this, the self-concept literally cracks like a broken mirror, forming two or more personalities. This level of fracture can lead to voice hearing, altered visions of reality, and odd body sensations. Warner gives an example of an adult client who stated, "I didn't come to this session. The child part brought me." Sometimes the client may switch to a differing personality, which the client has little control. In the case of the client I just described, it could mean that one personality trusts and feels safe with the therapist, while the other personality doesn't. Warner proposes that a continued lack of empathy shown to a child will leave them having a very fragile process of experiencing emotion, which could be overwhelming or frightening. Warner states that clients who experience fragile process find difficulty in controlling the intensity and focus of their experience. This may include the following difficulties: holding on to the experience, regulating the intensity of it, naming what the experience is, and talking about the experience. So how is working with fragile process different to working in other areas of therapy? Therapists working with clients who have a fragile process empathise with and give positive regard to all the differing voices that exist in the client's lived world and multi-directional partiality. Certain physical aspects of the counsellor-client relationship may need special attention for the client to be able to stay within their process. Knowing that the sessions will take place at the same time of day and week and that the session will start in the same way. Also, the physical arrangements in the room, such as placements of chairs and tables, often reassures the client. Even small changes that in usual circumstances are insignificant can damage the client's ability to engage therapeutically. For example, meeting in a different room or meeting at a different time may be experienced by the client as terminally destroying the therapeutic alliance without certainty that it can be restored. On the other hand, clients who experience fragile process often feel the need to have considerable control over the arrangements of the session. Being able to adjust the length of sessions, have sessions at certain times of day, or arrange the room in a way that feels comfortable may allow a client to connect with processes that would be otherwise inaccessible. The therapist needs to be attentive and thoughtful that the client may not have the words to describe their experiences and should provide the space for the client to use their own words. Sometimes clients who feel misunderstood by the therapist may become angry or give up searching for the right words. With time and a thoughtful, attentive therapist, the client may be able to integrate the disassociative parts of their personality and become whole again, or in the words of Carl Rogers, the organismic whole. Perhaps one of the greatest achievements of Margaret Warner and this new direction in the person-centred approach is that she challenges the medical model of psychosis and how it is treated.
Rory, thank you so much for that. Interesting as always. And I like how it just echoes what Carl Rogers said. It's about working at the client's pace and that each client will be presenting differently and really being mindful for where they're at, working fragilely, I guess, and gently with the client at a time and a pace that really suits for them. And of course, you cannot listen to that without wanting to download the associated handout. And to get that, you go to counsellingtutor.com, click on the podcast tab, and you just go to episode 34 and you can get Rory's download that free of charge. You just pop in your email address and we'll send it to you of that episode. Thank you, Rory.
Yeah, and that brings us on, doesn't it, to a perennial topic in counselling and psychotherapy, which is confidentiality, Ken.
Yeah.
And how easy it is to break it. Do you want me to share my birdseed story?
I do.
Ken?
I do.
Right.
I want to hear the birdseed story.
Okay. Well, picture this. Rory had ventured out of counselling towers and he'd gone to buy some birdseed for his bird box. And, well, I don't know, I'm talking about myself in the third person. I went to I went to buy some birdseed, and I went to a well-known hardware store in the UK, which sells absolutely everything. And I was in the queue with a bag of birdseed, and next to me was my wife who'd bought some bits and bobs. And I looked, and in front of me was my client, who was also shopping at this. And my client turned to me and said, "How are you?" And I said, "Oh, very well, thank you." And because and this is the important thing, we'd contracted for what would happen if we met each other, out and about, because at that time I counselled in my local town where I live, so I would bump into clients. So that was in our contract. So I said, "Oh, how are you doing?" Yeah. And it was a very brief conversation. She bought what she would bought. I bought the birdseed. And when we got outside, my wife said to me, "Who was that?"
Yeah.
And I was immediately in an ethical dilemma. Unfortunately, I'd sat. My wife and myself had sat down when I started training, and I'd done the module on confidentiality. And I said, there are some parts of my life that I won't be able to talk to you about, and that's my practice. And that's because that kind of goes with the territory of being a therapist. And we talked that through. And luckily, my wife just said, she looked at me. I was very uncomfortable at this point. And my wife said to me, "I better not ask, had I?" And I said, "No." And that was it.
Yeah.
And off we went. Now, I'm sure that my wife garnered the knowledge that this woman was my client. But, what do you do in a situation like that? I made the best of what was a difficult call, really. But it does bring us to the idea that sometimes holding confidentiality may not be as easy as we think it is. I wonder what your thoughts are on that, Ken.
Yeah, I hear you. And I guess what you did within that situation was the best that you possibly could.
Yep.
And you had, and this was what was really important for me, I actually wrote it down as you said it, you had contracted with your client as to how you would act if outside of the therapy room. And that's something to keep in mind. If you're on placement, have you covered this with your clients? What happens if they see you in a shop? Now, I do similarly with my clients. I contract with them and I say, if I was to see you out and about, and what I say is, I will never approach you. I will never say hello to you. I will never acknowledge you unless you say hi to me. If you say hi to me, because they have the choice to say hi to you, I wouldn't want to appear to be rude. But if I saw someone that was my client out and about and hadn't contracted this, or maybe they were working in a shop and I went in to buy something, how might I deal with that? So contracting is really, really important here. And we're speaking about inadvertently dropping confidentiality or breaking confidentiality, not on purpose. And of course, it's a bedrock of counselling, of psychotherapy. It's there because it has to be there so the client can feel safe. But it's really easy for that to drop. An example of that is if you're working within a counselling room and it's a particularly hot day and you maybe open the window. Can what you're saying in that room be heard? Downstairs, next door, in a different room? Is confidentiality being broken without your knowledge? And it's your responsibility to make sure that that is a safe environment. And I know I practice from my home, and I have a first floor counselling room. And when I sit in my counselling room, if my window is open, I can hear people talking, walking past. I can't hear exactly what they're saying. So I did an experiment. And I got my daughter and my wife to sit in my room where I counsel and have a chat. And I went downstairs and I stood and I strained my ears to have a good listen to see if I could hear them. And I couldn't. However, I decided that if I was working with a client and the window was slightly open and they believed they could hear somebody talking, walking past, then maybe they would feel unsafe that their material could potentially. So just based on that, I work with my window closed and make sure that the room is well ventilated before a client comes in. So it's around those, and I'll share my story, like your birdseed story. I remember working with a client, and we were coming to the end of our session, and we were coming to the end of our time together. It was our last counselling session together, so we weren't in deep material. We were kind of recapping on what had happened in our process. And I remember the client looking over my right shoulder with kind of a puzzled look. And I didn't really want to make too much of it because a client can be thinking or processing, but I was looking at this and it seemed out of place for this client. And I eventually kind of looked over my shoulder, and there at the window on the first floor was a man cleaning the window with a big ladder that I hadn't heard. He'd obviously come along and put his ladder up, and he was standing there polishing the window, and this client was staring right into his face, and he was staring right into her face, and it was a very awkward moment. The client found it very funny and had a good laugh about it, but it was definitely something that I needed to consider. And what had happened, I knew when the window cleaners came, but they'd missed their regular day because it had snowed, and they'd just decided to come on another day. So I had the opportunity to speak after the fact with the window cleaner and say, do not come on such a days, because I practice on those days. But great lesson learnt, and potentially confidentiality could have been broken there without me knowing, without me planning to. By mistake. Yeah,
absolutely, Ken. And I think that, we don't want to get too. We need to have due care and attention, and be professional. But as you've heard in those two examples, the birdseed and the man with the chamois leather, or woman with the chamois leather, I don't know.
No, it was a man. It was a man with the chamois leather.
Man with the chamois leather. Yes. Is that. There's some things that are literally out of our control. But as I always used to say to my students, we hope for the best and we plan for the worst. And by having that conversation with my wife, by having that contract in place, as Ken does, that limits the impact of it. And it's a defence. You can put a clear. If someone were to complain, you would have a defensible process that you could call on, a cogent defence, I think my learned friends call it. So there we go. And that brings us really to the end of this episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. We've come to the end of it, and as always, it's a real pleasure talking to our audience out there. We have a huge amount of downloads now, Ken, don't we? How many people download our podcast on a regular basis?
Tens and tens of thousands. I think it was just over 100,000 the last time I looked. So, and that's only on our what are we at, 34th episode? So it's and we get reviews from you, which we so appreciate. If you have a moment or two, pop onto iTunes, give us a review. We love reviews. We really appreciate them. It makes it feel so worthwhile. Not that it doesn't feel worthwhile anyway, because we get emails and we know that you hopefully get something out of listening to this. What an episode. So we start off with looking at how you protect the information that you store on your computer, leading us right into that, considering confidentiality with what is on your computer as well. We closed off speaking about confidentiality and how it can be inadvertently broken, and how we need to watch for that and just be mindful as reflective practitioners. And of course, in the middle of that sandwich was fantastic theory with Rory, looking at fragile process, one of the more contemporary developments in the person-centered approach from, of course, Dr. Margaret Warner. Great episode.
So that brings this episode to a close. So no matter where in the world you're listening to us, if you're listening in the plains of Arkansas, in the middle of the square in Russia, or indeed in sunny Manchester, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.